Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. This will be my final part of the respiratory system lecture videos, and our topic is neurochemical control of breathing. So the learning objectives for this time is we're going to look at medullary rhythmicity area, and we're going to look at apneustic and pneumotaxic areas of the pons, and we're going to look at sensory receptors. Right, the control of ventilation basically can be divided into three main parts. So you have the sensors, the central controller, and the effectors. So basically, when there's changes, the sensors sense that changes, and the sensors will give the information to the central controller, which will then be decided what to do with the change of the condition or whatever change that is in place. So the output will be transmitted to the effectors. The information on what to do based on the change will be sent to the effectors. Usually it's the respiratory muscles to carry out what's needed for um, to overcome or to go through the change. So the respiratory control centers are located in the pons and medulla, and you can see the pons and medulla are located right over here and here. Okay. So the respiratory center in the medulla, there is dorsal respiratory group, which is responsible for inspiration, and then you have the ventral respiratory group, which is responsible for inspiration and also expiration, and you have the pre-Botzinger complex, which is responsible for the rhythm of the respiration, and this is similar to the SA node of the heart. If you remember, sinoatrial node or SA node is the one is the pacemaker of the heart. So pre-Botzinger complex is something like that. All right, and next you have pons. In the pons there is apneustic center and also pneumotaxic center, and we will discuss about all of these respiratory centers in later on. So again, in this slide, I'd just like to show you the location of each of these respiratory centers. And remember, the main respiratory center are the dorsal and the ventral respiratory group, and then you have the pacemaker, pre-Botzinger complex, and what do you call that? Other respiratory centers include pneumotaxic and apneustic center. Right, so there are other regions of the brain that can affect respiration, and one of it is in the cortex. This one is voluntary control. I mean, if you recall that the area of the brain, cortex area, is involved in most of voluntary control, right? It means that when you're conscious, so you can consciously breathe in and breathe out. Like when I can tell you, okay, 1 2 3 breathe in, and everyone inhale, right? And I can tell you, okay, 1 2 3 breathe out, and everyone exhale. So yes, you can control your respiration, but to a certain extent. We'll talk about that later as well. And then the limbic system and hypothalamus, this is related to the emotional state of that person. If you're happy, if you're nervous, if you're scared, and that can also affect your respiration depending on the situation. Yeah, so we talked about sensors in the previous slide, and you know that sensors sense the changes, and they will send this information to the control center. So we have different types of sensors. I mean, depending on the location and function, right? So we have central chemoreceptors, and we have peripheral chemoreceptors, we have lung receptors, and others. And we'll talk about all these chemoreceptors and lung receptors and other receptors in a bit more detail later. Right, so in this diagram, we can see that the where are the sensors are located. Right, so the central chemoreceptors are located near the control center, which is located right here. And then you have the peripheral chemoreceptors. This is the one. This is the aortic arch and at the carotid arch. And then you have the uh, uh, other receptors, such as in the lungs, okay, stretch receptors, and you have the irritant receptors. Also available there in the muscles and joints, receptors in the muscles and joints, and other receptors that we've talked about, for example, in the limbic system and the hypothalamus, where it's related to the emotional stimuli. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention that the high brain centers, the cerebral cortex that I've mentioned earlier, that is involved in a voluntary control over breathing. Alright, so now let's talk about the chemoreceptors. There are specialized tissues that respond to change in chemical composition of blood or other fluid. And we know that gas, they dissolved in plasma, and so when they get dissolved, the composition of the blood changes, and these are detected by the chemoreceptors. And so we have central chemoreceptor, and we also have peripheral chemoreceptor. And you know that from the previous diagram that I've shown in the previous slide, we've talked about the location of the central chemoreceptor. They are located in the medulla, which is very near to the control center of the respiratory control center. And we've talked about peripheral chemoreceptor as well, and they are located in the aortic and carotid arch, and right. So yeah, so that's about that. Okay, so now let's talk about the central chemoreceptor. And to understand this, I'd like you to recall the transport of carbon dioxide. And particularly, I want you to recall transport of carbon dioxide via the bicarbonate system. And we know that carbon dioxide combines with water to produce carbonic acid, and carbonic acid is unstable, and therefore it dissociates into bicarbonate and protons. So we can see here the bicarbonate and the proton right here is the end product, and an acid reaches this brain, and it can, of course, it cannot, go out from this blood vessel, but the this reaction reverses. So now proton combines with bicarbonate, and it will form carbonic acid. And remember, again, it is unstable, therefore it quickly dissociates into carbon dioxide and water, back into carbon dioxide and water. And we know that gas can diffuse easily. So when it forms carbon dioxide can now diffuse out, right? Right, so you can see here. So it diffuses out, and you know that in your body there's fluid, there's water, and again when it comes out, it combines with water, and the same reaction occurs. So carbon dioxide combines with water, and then it becomes carbonic acid, and then it dissociates into bicarbonate, and again a proton. And you know that proton is is a H, hydrogen plus, right? So it can change the level of pH level. It can alter the acidity in the brain. So with that proton and bicarbonate, with that proton will affect the chemical change, and therefore it will trigger the chemoreceptor. Now the chemoreceptor that we're talking about here is the central chemoreceptor, and central chemoreceptor are very sensitive about the change, and it is affected by the pH change because of the proton ion that is being produced through the carbon dioxide that has diffused out from the blood vessel. Okay, so it is not directly affected by um, carbon dioxide level, but it is affected by the pH because carbon dioxide diffuses out and it forms bicarbonate and proton, and this is uh, is the one that triggers the chemoreceptor. So again, in my slide here, I'm mentioning again what we've talked about in the diagram in previous slide. The central chemoreceptor, they respond to the pH. We say that it responds to the pH because although carbon dioxide is the one that diffuses out, but then again it combines with water, and proton and bicarbonate is formed after carbonic acid dissociate, right? And so this proton affects the pH, the acidity, and that is what triggers the central chemoreceptor. Alright, so the sites of peripheral chemoreceptors, I've talked about this in my previous slide, but again, I want you to look at where are they located. And if this is a heart, and this is the aortic arch, they're right there. You can see the black dots right there, and this is the carotid arch, and you can see that they're right there. So these are the peripheral chemoreceptors, and they transmit information regarding the change through, if it's aortic body, it's through the vagus nerve, and if it's from the carotid body, it is through the glossopharyngeal nerve. And this is just to show you the carotid body and its response. And you can see that as the level, look at the arterial partial pressure of oxygen here, and you can see that if the partial pressure of oxygen reduces to about, let's look at first right over here, if it's about this is about maybe 70, 60, then you have uh, the curve becomes, the curve moves upward um, rather fast compared to the later part of this graph. You can see that the curve is not that steep, so the response is fast, and the response is how you say, increased exponentially if the partial pressure of oxygen reduces. And you can see that as it reduces further, the response becomes greater and greater, right? You can see this bottom part of this graph right here. You can see that the response is greater. Alright, now let's look at carotid bodies. It respond to partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and pH. And I have put partial pressure of oxygen first for the peripheral chemoreceptors here. And I mean, it is responding to the arterial part, not the venous, partial pressure of oxygen. And basically, if you compare to the central chemoreceptor, they respond primarily to the pH, to the change of pH. But if you look at the peripheral chemoreceptors, they respond mainly to the level of oxygen rather than looking at the level of pH or the level of carbon dioxide, but they do respond to level of carbon dioxide and pH as well. But just to for your information, they primarily respond to the level of oxygen first, and then they and then the rest. Right, so now let's look at lung receptors and what are the type of lung receptors. Okay, firstly, let's talk about the pulmonary stretch receptors. They are also called slowly adapting pulmonary stretch receptors, and it is responsible for the Herringberry reflex. And this is important to prevent the lung from overinflation. And we know that lung can inflate, and we do that when we inspire, when we do inspiration, right? So, and when we do that, these stretch receptors are being stretched and therefore triggered, and to a certain extent that if for example they are stretched too much, they will prevent further stretching, and this will prevent further inflation. And this is just to be safe, and it prevents your lung from overinflating, and therefore you when they are triggered, you have immediately after that exhalation process, since inspiration is being uh, stopped, and then it will go straight to the exhalation, and this will lead to increase in the frequency of breathing, increase in the frequency of the respiration. Right, so the pulmonary stretch receptors are located in the smooth muscles um, of the small airways. Okay, and then let's look at now the irritant receptors, which is number 2. The irritant receptors are also called rapidly adapting pulmonary stretch receptors, and they're called rapidly adapting because the response is rapid. And when we talk about uh, one person, for example, being exposed to irritants, for example, cigarette smoke, and when you accidentally inhale that irritants, the cigarette smokes, for example, and this will trigger the irritant receptors and will cause a response such as coughing it out, so stuff like that. And irritant receptors can be found in the in between the epithelium of the respiratory tract. And then we have J receptors, or called as pulmonary C fiber receptors or juxtacapillary receptors, and these are involved in juxtacapillary response. And what's that? These are these J receptors can be found in the within the alveolar walls, and they are reported to be to respond to events such as pulmonary edema, pulmonary emboli, and pneumonia, congestive heart failure. And so far, it is not known what is the exact physiologic function of J receptors, but they appear to be, related to what I've mentioned before, to this pulmonary edema, emboli, pneumonia, congestive heart failure, and they can be found in the walls of the bronchi, the larynx, and the nose. Right, and the last one is the bronchial C fibers. So the bronchial C fibers um, related to allergic reaction, and yeah, in the latest, it has been reported that they participate in allergic airway inflammation, and again, similar to J receptors, uh, more research on these J receptors and bronchial C fibers uh, uh, can be done to find out what are the exact what are the exact physiologic function of all these receptors. Right, so there are other receptors that can influence our respiratory system. And first and foremost, we have the nose and the upper airways. And this is, I mean, I think you understand clearly how this can affect our respiratory system, how this can affect our breathing, right? And then we have joint and muscle, and this is particularly important if you're for example, if there is a lot of movement involved, and this also affects breathing, right? I mean, if for example we're doing exercise or whatnot, right? So this can also affect our breathing. And then we have the gamma system. And what about gamma system? So gamma system, if you can recall, or if you have learned about the alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron, we know that we're talking about the muscles, and alpha motor neuron is involved in voluntary response, as the gamma motor neuron, when in gamma systems, we're talking about the involuntary uh, response. And then we have the arterial baroreceptors, and you know that baroreceptors, if you have studied regarding baroreceptors before, and if you recall that baroreceptors are receptors detecting blood pressure, okay, and so that can also influence our breathing. And then lastly, we have pain and temperature, and you know that pain and temperature can also affect our breathing, in a sense that, if you're feeling if you're in pain, or if you're in a place where it's really hot. It's really hot, for example, you're in a sauna, and your breathing is affected. You might be hyperventilating, so things like that. So bear in mind that there are other things that can affect breathing. And remember, I've mentioned in the earlier part of this lecture, I've mentioned that emotions can also affect breathing, right? So bear in mind that there are a lot of things that can affect breathing, and not just the stimuli, for example, the common stimuli by the level of oxygen or the level of carbon dioxide. I mean, that's very direct, and we all know that that will definitely affect breathing process. Okay, so let's look at effectors, and we've talked about this in, I think, my first and second lecture, that I've talked about the muscles, uh, where we talk about the mechanics of breathing, right? So if you remember from my previous lecture, and you know that the diaphragm muscles, naturally, when they are in a relaxed state, they are dome shape. It's dome shape, right? Like this. Let me just show you dome shape. So this is what we call dome shape. And when it is contracted, it will flattens out. It becomes something like this, right? So therefore, it increases the volume, the lung volume. So if let's say this is the lung volume, so definitely this one is larger, at a larger volume compared to this one, right? Compared to this one. And then we're going to look at the intercostal muscles. And if you remember, the intercostal muscles, particularly the external intercostal muscles, they are involved in inspiratory process. And usually we mention that diaphragm and external intercostal muscles are the main effectors, but some books also include internal intercostal muscles. But never mind, as long as you understand that the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, when they contract, um, diaphragm, when they contract, it becomes the dome shape flattens out, and the external intercostal muscles, when they contract, the ribs move upward and outward, right? So then it's fine. And then you have the accessory muscles. These are the muscles that are involved in breathing process. If let's say you want to put an extra effort into breathing, if you are not just doing breathing in a relaxed manner, you are putting an extra effort into, for example, I'm asking you to, okay, let's breathe in, everybody, deep breath, for example, and then you are voluntarily doing the breathing process, and you are putting in extra effort into the breathing process, right? So in this case, accessory muscles will be involved, and some of the accessory muscles are involved in the breathing process are the abdominal muscles. So you have the rectus abdominis, you have the external oblique, you have the internal oblique, and the transversus abdominis. So the response to carbon dioxide is the primary factor in the control of ventilation. And if you remember previously in my video lectures, we've talked about the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and also partial pressure of oxygen. And let's recall it now, okay? So the partial pressure of oxygen, the blood that is coming back from the lung after being exposed to 100% of oxygen is, and so the partial pressure of the blood coming back from the lung is at 100 millimeter mercury. And some books use 110, some use 120, but it doesn't matter. You can just use 100 to make it easier for you to remember. 100. And then the blood coming back from the tissues after it has been used, after the tissues have used up all the oxygen. So now the partial pressure of the oxygen will come down to 40 millimeter mercury. So you can see the range of 40 to 100, that's about 60. The change is 60. If you minus 100 from 40, you get 60. So that's a lot of change. And compare that to partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide, for example, blood coming back from the tissue, so you have a high level of carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide will be at 46, some books 45, but it doesn't matter, you can just use 45 or 46, is fine. So 46 millimeter mercury. And then the carbon dioxide partial pressure at the lung, which means that after you exhale, so now the carbon dioxide has left your body, so the level of carbon dioxide will be reduced, and it comes down to partial pressure of carbon dioxide to 40 millimeter mercury. So you can see the range of the concentration of carbon dioxide is from 40 to 46. So that's if you minus that 46 and 40, you get 6. So that's it's a little a change compared to the wide range of change in the partial pressure of oxygen from 40 to 100, and whereas carbon dioxide is only from 40 to 46. And I don't know if it's if you can see that, but if you can't, I'm telling you now that the range of change of concentration of carbon dioxide is very, very much smaller compared to the range of oxygen concentration. And this is because carbon dioxide, majority of the carbon dioxide is being transported using the bicarbonate pathway. And why is it using the bicarbonate pathway? Is because carbon dioxide affects the pH of the body, and if you have a very high level of carbon dioxide, it can alter the pH value significantly, and we don't want that. It's very detrimental for the body to have that change. So we want to keep the change very minimal, at minimal. We don't want that much of a change because it can affect the body. The body works optimally at at a certain value, right? A certain composition, chemical composition, and we don't want that change a lot. And having a lot of carbon dioxide will change that. So that is why the change in carbon dioxide is only from 40 to 46 is the only allowed change. And if it's exceeding that 46, a body will work really hard to remove that extra carbon dioxide. And that's why we have the response to carbon dioxide as the primary factor in the control of ventilation. So uh, the response of ventilation to reduce oxygen, it has it's not that significant compared to carbon dioxide. Previously we've talked about the carbon dioxide level or carbon dioxide changes. A little bit of that carbon dioxide changes will affect significantly the ventilation rate, right? But the level of oxygen, on the other hand, does not really affect change, because you have that carbon dioxide being uh, greatly affects the ventilation. So it is not really or primarily responding to the changes in oxygen, since it is already responding to the change in carbon dioxide. So usually in a normal condition, it does not respond to the level of oxygen, because before the level of oxygen can change, you already have that the ventilation altered due to the change in the carbon dioxide level. So usually this does not this does not really affect the ventilation. But if, let's say, if carbon dioxide change has triggered the change in the ventilation rate, but also your body is still in need of more changes, in need of more how to say it is still in need of removing excess carbon dioxide and all of that, and is still in need of oxygen due to greatly reduce oxygen level. Only then it will be only then this response to reduce concentration of oxygen will take place. If, let's say, the response to carbon dioxide is not enough, right? So then you have the response to reduce oxygen. And the response to reduced pH, and this one is related to the carbon dioxide. Again, I would like to remind you that the carbon dioxide is being transported majorly using the bicarbonate pathway. And if you recall back the pathway, the carbon dioxide combines with water to produce carbonic acid, and this acid is unstable and it quickly dissociates into proton and bicarbonate. And bicarbonate will diffuse out from will move out from these red blood cells, and it will be in the plasma. But the proton, the hydrogen ion, or we call it as a proton, so the proton will stay inside the red blood cells and attached to the hemoglobin and being carried by the hemoglobin. So why is it so? Is that if, let's say, the proton is being released and move out from the red blood cells, it will greatly affect the pH level. And you know that the pH level, our body is very sensitive to that, and we need to be to have a stable pH level, and we need to be sticking to that level, and we don't want a lot of change, because that change will greatly affect, you know, a lot of enzymes in our body, proteins and all that, all the processes, all these biological processes works best at our optimal pH, and we don't want a lot of, and we don't want that to change, and we don't want to affect all these biological process that is occurring in our body, and that's why we need to maintain the pH. We don't want a lot of change. And finally, when we look at the response to exercise, I mean, this is similar to the condition that I've mentioned earlier, where you have increased level of carbon dioxide, and you know it's very related to the pH, to the acidity. And usually when we exercise, our body doesn't go into acidic conditions straight away. It will take quite a while before the level of carbon dioxide being removed from our body, and the rate of carbon dioxide being removed and the rate of carbon dioxide being produced is, you know, imbalanced, and therefore our body starts to become slightly acidic, and that's why I put the pH is normal except at heavy exercise, because our body has this, you know, mechanism to make sure that the pH is stabilized and at a stable level. And and I leave you to it to look through how our body responds to exercise. You can read up on these what are the mechanisms involved, and how does this affect our body. The rate, this is related to the rate. You know, it's all about homeostasis, is all about the rate. If the rate of carbon dioxide production exceed the rate of carbon dioxide removal, then you have that imbalance of, you have that extra carbon dioxide, and that's why after a heavy exercise, you know, that person will still be ventilating at a faster rate because it's trying to remove all those excess carbon dioxide, all those, you know, extra carbon dioxide that is being produced, and it's trying to get back the pH back to normal. Yeah, so and I think that's it. This is my last slide, and this is the end of this lecture video, and this is my final lecture video on the respiratory system. And for my student, for your exam, please take note that I will be asking only the basic physiology part, slightly into the you know, abnormal state. But again, if you understand the processes involved in the you know, respiratory system and what I explained, and I'm sure you will be able to understand, and I'm sure you will be able to answer whatever I ask you in the exam. And if you do have question, please text me. You know my number. Text me and ask me anything at all. Just ask me, and I will be happy to help you. And that is all. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time, inshallah, if we get to meet again. Assalamualaikum. Bye bye.